What would you do if a neighbor you thought you could trust, someone you believed was a normal part of your community, trapped your daughter in their basement? I didn't see it coming. I thought Karen, the overbearing HOA board member, was just another stickler for rules. But when I answered the door one afternoon to find her standing there, furious and accusing my daughter of something I couldn't even wrap my mind around, my world turned upside down. She claimed Lily had been snooping around her house, so she locked her in the basement. It didn't make sense. My daughter was terrified, and Karen? Well, she looked like she had no regret. This wasn't just about a petty dispute. This was something much darker. Something I would have never expected from someone so entrenched in the community. But the real shock was yet to come. What happened next will leave you speechless. Stay with me. Before I dive into this jaw-dropping story, I want to ask you one thing. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city name in the comments below and let me know. It's always amazing to see how stories like this can travel so far. And I'd love to hear from everyone, no matter where you are. And hey, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button because you do not want to miss what happens next in this insane journey. Now, let me set the stage for you. Picture this. You've lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood for years. You know your neighbors, you attend HOA meetings, and life seems pretty calm, right? But sometimes behind closed doors, things are not as they seem. That's what I learned the hard way. I never imagined that someone I thought I could trust, someone who was supposed to help maintain peace in the neighborhood, could turn out to be the worst nightmare of my family. I'm talking about Karen, the self-appointed enforcer of the Homeowners Association. You've probably met someone like her before, the one who knows every little rule and isn't afraid to make you follow it no matter the cost. But what Karen did to my daughter was beyond anything I could have ever imagined. It all started on an ordinary afternoon. My daughter, Lily, was playing outside with her friends when Karen accused her of trespassing and then, without warning, locked her in the basement. What came next shocked me to my core and changed everything. Stay tuned, because the twists and turns that followed are something you won't believe. Let's go back to where it all began. It started like any other afternoon, one of those calm, lazy weekends where everything seemed normal. My daughter, Lily, was in the backyard playing with her friends. The weather was perfect, bright sun, not too hot, just right for kids to run around and let off steam. As I bustled about the kitchen preparing a late lunch, I felt at ease, thinking about how peaceful our little suburban neighborhood was. I had no reason to suspect that, in just a few hours, my entire world would be turned upside down. But then, the knock at the door came. At first, I thought nothing of it. It was Saturday after all. Neighbors often stop by to chat or ask a quick favor. But when I opened the door, I saw Karen standing there, her face red with anger. Her eyes were wide, and there was a sharpness to her voice I had never heard before. "Your daughter was in my basement," she exclaimed, pointing a trembling finger at Lily, who was standing just behind me. Lily looked terrified. Her wide eyes were filled with a mix of confusion and fear. Karen's words didn't make sense. I stared at her, trying to piece together what she was talking about. I had never seen this side of her before, and it left me rattled. She was normally so composed, so precise. "What are you talking about, Karen?" I asked, trying to process the accusation. She was snooping around my house, and I had to lock her in my basement. Karen hissed, her voice almost shaking with anger. She was trespassing and going through my things. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind racing. Locking her in the basement? This couldn't be right. I knew Lily. I knew her well. She wasn't a troublemaker, never had been. My heart started pounding in my chest. Something about this felt off, wrong in ways I couldn't fully understand at that moment. Lily, who had been standing behind me, now stepped forward, her body trembling. She glanced at Karen, then back at me, and opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Tears welled up in her eyes as she struggled to find the courage to explain. But what could she say? How do you explain something that you couldn't fully process yourself? I glanced back at Karen, then at Lily. There is something deeply unsettling about the whole situation. Why would Karen accuse Lily of such an extreme act? The basement? This wasn't just a misunderstanding about a garden hose or something trivial like that. This was serious. I tried to keep my cool, but my voice had a slight tremble in it as I spoke again. Karen, are you telling me you locked my daughter in your basement? Karen nodded vigorously. She was poking around my property and I caught her. She needs to learn some respect. I wasn't going to stand by and let her get away with it. She's just like the others. All these kids running wild, thinking they can do whatever they want, and no one calls them out for it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The basement? The basement? This wasn't some small scolding or a harmless mistake. This was an extreme response. No matter how frustrated Karen might have been with kids running around the neighborhood, this was not how you handled things. But I couldn't just dismiss her accusations. I needed to understand what happened. Lily, what happened? I asked gently, crouching down to her level. She wiped her eyes quickly, as though trying to hold back the flood of emotions that were threatening to spill over. I didn't do anything wrong, she whispered, voice barely audible. I was playing outside with my friends. I didn't even go near her house. Karen sneered, her face tight with annoyance. That's a lie. I saw her. She was right outside my back door, looking in through the window. She came inside my yard and went straight to the basement door. I could feel the tension between us building. I wasn't sure who to believe. I knew my daughter, and I knew she wasn't one to sneak around or break rules. But there was something about Karen's certainty that made me question everything. My heart ached as I watched Lily, who looked utterly bewildered. She had never been a liar, and now she was faced with a version of events that didn't even make sense to her. Karen, you locked her in your basement? I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. Yes, she replied, her tone almost defensive. She was sneaking around, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. I locked the door for her own good. Maybe next time, she'll think twice before coming onto my property. There it was, the arrogance in her voice, the sense of power. It was becoming clear that this wasn't just a simple act of discipline. This was something far darker. Karen wasn't just angry about what had happened. She was reveling in her control. I looked at Lily, who was still trembling. I could tell she didn't understand what had just happened, and she wasn't sure how to react. I wanted to protect her. I wanted to lash out at Karen, to make her see the injustice of what she had done. But instead, I took a deep breath and held my composure. I'm going to call the police, I said, turning back to Karen. What you did is illegal. You cannot just lock a child in your basement like that. Karen's eyes widened, but her response was quick. You can't prove anything. My word against hers. Her words stung, but I couldn't let them stop me. My mind raced with options. How could she be so brazen? Was this really just about Lily? Or was there something deeper here? Something Karen had been hiding beneath the surface? Karen stood there, arms crossed, waiting for me to make the next move. But in that moment, I wasn't sure what to do next. Everything I thought I knew about her had just been shattered. After a few moments of silence, I finally spoke, my voice hard. You're going to regret this, Karen. You will not get away with this. With that, I turned to Lily and ushered her inside the house. She followed me silently, her small steps hesitant and unsure. I could feel her pain, her confusion, and above all, her fear. The woman she had seen as just another neighbor had turned into a threat, someone who had intentionally trapped her, scared her, and manipulated her. But I wasn't going to let this slide. Not by a long shot. This was just the beginning. I couldn't imagine how this would all play out, but one thing was certain. I was going to fight to make sure Karen faced the consequences of her actions. I only hoped it wasn't too late. To understand the depth of what had just happened, we first need to take a step back. Karen was no ordinary neighbor. She wasn't just another face in the crowd of suburban dwellers. No, she had a powerful position in our community. She was one of the most vocal and influential members of the Homeowners Association, HOA, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was no coincidence. Karen's behavior, her control over the HOA, and her twisted sense of entitlement had been brewing for years, and now it had reached a boiling point. When we first moved into the neighborhood, Karen had been one of the first people to introduce herself. At first glance, she seemed like your typical HOA enthusiast, well-organized, eager to ensure that everything was in order, and willing to go the extra mile to make the neighborhood look pristine. She lived just a few houses down from ours, and our interactions with her were minimal at first. A friendly wave here, a passing comment about the lawn there. It was the kind of neighborly behavior that you'd expect in a well-kept suburban community, but there was always something a little off about her. She wasn't just passionate about making the neighborhood nice, she was obsessed with it. She had a way of making sure that everyone followed the rules, her rules, whether it was an overgrown hedge or a mailbox that was a few inches off-center. Karen seemed to be the first person to point it out, and if you didn't fix the issue in the exact manner she deemed appropriate, you could bet that she would escalate the matter, sometimes in ways that left you wondering if it was all just a personal vendetta. At first, I shrugged it off. After all, she was just doing her job, right? That's what the HOA was supposed to do. Make sure everything stayed neat, orderly, and up to code. But as time passed, I started to notice a pattern. Karen wasn't just concerned about minor infractions. She was hyper-focused on controlling the lives of everyone around her, micromanaging the most insignificant details of people's homes and personal lives. Some of the older neighbors began to talk. They'd say things like, "Karen's really in charge around here," or, "You'll never win an argument with her. She gets what she wants, no matter what." I initially dismissed these comments as exaggerations, but as the months went by, I started to see what they meant. For instance, there was the time she had insisted that every resident repaint their fences a particular shade of gray. "It's about maintaining the community's aesthetic," she said, even though no one else seemed to care. But when a few neighbors pushed back, Karen made their lives difficult. She brought up fines, penalties, and complaints to the HOA board, each time pushing harder to get her way. Some neighbors gave in just to avoid the hassle. Others, like me, chose to ignore her petty demands, but I could sense the tension growing in the community. But none of that prepared me for what happened with my daughter. At the time, I didn't fully understand how much power Karen really had. As I mentioned earlier, she was on the HOA board, but she wasn't just a board member, she was the one who ran things behind the scenes. Over the years, she had cultivated a web of influence, slowly but surely taking control of every decision made by the HOA. It wasn't just about rules and regulations anymore. It was about control, manipulation, and enforcing her will on the people around her. I'd seen how the HOA meetings went. At first, they seemed like normal community gatherings where we discussed issues like lawn care, trash pickup, and the occasional neighborhood event. But as Karen's power grew, so did her influence over the decisions made in those meetings. People would quietly disagree with her, but no one dared speak up. They were afraid of the consequences. It was in one of these meetings that I first realized how deep her influence went. A few months before the incident with Lily, the HOA had proposed a new rule that would severely restrict the use of front yards. You couldn't place any decorative items like lawn chairs or even plant flowers unless they were approved by the board first. The rationale was to maintain a uniform look across the neighborhood, but it felt suffocating. It wasn't about aesthetics, it was about control. When I voiced my concerns during the meeting, Karen shot me down quickly. She made it clear that anyone who didn't follow the new rule would face consequences, and she even implied that my compliance would be watched carefully. Her tone was smooth, almost too polished, but beneath it was an edge of something far darker, a desire to dominate, to ensure that everyone fell in line with her vision of the world. That moment stuck with me. I had always known she had a strong personality, but this was something else. This wasn't about being an effective HOA member. This was about establishing power and maintaining control, no matter the cost. After that meeting, I started to pay more attention to Karen's behavior. I began hearing whispers from other neighbors, stories of how she had made their lives miserable over minor infractions. One neighbor, a sweet elderly woman, told me how Karen had sent her multiple letters demanding that she trim the bushes in her front yard, even though they were perfectly within the HOA's guidelines. When the woman refused, Karen took it further, bringing up fines and even threatening legal action. The woman was terrified, and all she wanted was peace in her own home. And that was the thing about Karen. She thrived on fear. She used her position to intimidate people, to make them feel small and insignificant. She would wait for someone to make the smallest mistake, and then she'd pounce. If you didn't follow her exact vision, she'd find a way to make sure you regretted it. Her power didn't come from any official position or title. It came from her ability to manipulate and control. But the most chilling realization came after Lily was locked in Karen's basement. As I stood there, trying to make sense of the situation, it became clear that Karen wasn't just punishing Lily for a minor infraction. She was sending a message. This wasn't about Lily's actions. It was about control, about asserting dominance over someone who was, in her mind, an outsider. I couldn't help but wonder, how many other families had Karen tried to control? How many others had been subjected to her quiet tyranny, too scared to speak out? It wasn't just a case of a bad neighbor. This was a person who had crossed a line, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the incident with Lily was just the tip of the iceberg. This had been going on for far longer than I had realized, and now it was time to take a stand. But before I could do that, I needed to understand Karen even better. I needed to uncover her true motives, and I needed to figure out how to fight back. The community needed to know who they were really dealing with. And so, I began to dig deeper into Karen's history, into the web of manipulation she had woven over the years. What I uncovered left me speechless. The incident that unfolded that afternoon is one that will forever be etched in my mind. What should have been a simple day of outdoor play quickly turned into a nightmare. My daughter Lily had been outside with her friends, as she often was on warm afternoons. They ran around the yard, laughing and playing, enjoying the simple pleasures of childhood. I remember hearing their voices drifting through the open window, their carefree laughter mingling with the sound of birds singing in the trees. It was the kind of neighborhood where you could feel safe and relaxed. At least, that's what I thought. I was inside, busy with housework, when I heard the knock at the door. It wasn't the casual knock of a friend stopping by or the usual delivery person. This knock was urgent, insistent, and filled with an undercurrent of tension. I set down the dishes I was washing and made my way to the door. When I opened it, the sight of Karen standing there, her face flushed with anger, immediately struck me as strange. I could sense the hostility in her presence. She wasn't the calm, controlled Karen I had encountered at the HOA meetings. No, this woman was furious, her body language tight, her fists clenched at her sides. It was as if she was about to explode. "Your daughter was in my basement," she blurted out before I could even greet her. Her words hung in the air, confusing me, and I could feel my stomach tighten with unease. "What?" I asked, my voice shaky. "What are you talking about?" "She was trespassing on my property," Karen continued, her eyes narrowing as she pointed a shaking finger at Lily, who was standing behind me, looking more frightened than I had ever seen her. Lily was visibly trembling, her body frozen in place as she stared at Karen, wide-eyed and speechless. "I had to lock her in my basement," Karen declared, her voice cold and harsh. "She was snooping around, trying to get into places she doesn't belong. I couldn't just let her get away with it." I was stunned. The words didn't make sense. My mind raced to process what she was saying, but nothing seemed to add up. My daughter, a sweet and well-behaved child, had never given me reason to believe she was the type to wander onto someone's property uninvited, let alone sneak into their basement. I couldn't fathom why Karen would make such an accusation. And what did she mean by locking Lily in her basement? I turned to look at Lily, hoping to hear her side of the story, but she stood there, trembling, unable to speak. I could see the fear in her eyes, the confusion and helplessness, and my heart broke for her. This wasn't just about Karen's accusation. It was about how scared and small Lily felt in that moment. "Karen, this doesn't make any sense," I said, my voice firm despite the rising panic in my chest. "Lily has been playing outside with her friends. She hasn't gone anywhere near your property, And you have no right to lock her in your basement. What are you talking about? But Karen's expression didn't change. She didn't seem remorseful or apologetic. Instead, there was a coldness in her eyes, a kind of superiority. She's a troublemaker, Karen sneered. All these kids are running wild, thinking they can do whatever they want. I'm just making sure they learn some respect. If they can't follow the rules, they need to be punished. Her words struck me like a slap across the face. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The woman I had known for years, who had seemed so harmless, so involved in the community, was now standing in front of me, unapologetic about having locked my daughter in her basement. I couldn't let this go. I couldn't just stand there and accept what she was saying. My daughter had been wronged, and I wasn't going to let Karen get away with it. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. I'm calling the police, I said firmly. What you did is illegal. You can't just lock someone's child in your basement. Karen's response was a dismissive shrug. Go ahead. You won't prove anything. It's my word against hers. Her arrogance was palpable. She was trying to shift the blame, trying to turn the situation on its head as if she had done nothing wrong. But I wasn't backing down. This wasn't just about Lily anymore. This was about standing up to someone who had clearly overstepped her bounds, someone who thought she had the right to control others without consequences. I turned to Lily, who was still standing there in shock. She hadn't spoken a word, still too frightened to defend herself. I knelt down in front of her, gently cupping her face in my hands. Lily, I said softly, tell me what happened. What did Karen do to you? It took a moment before she found the courage to speak. Her voice was barely a whisper, but I could hear the fear in every word. I was playing outside with my friends. I didn't go near her house, Mom. I swear, I don't know why she's saying these things. I didn't do anything wrong. I hugged her tightly, reassuring her that everything would be okay, but inside, my mind was racing. I couldn't understand why Karen would lie like this. Why would she make such a serious accusation? Why had she locked my daughter in her basement? Before I could process everything, I turned back to Karen. You had no right to do this. I'm going to the police, and you'll have to explain yourself to them. But Karen's reaction was chilling. Do what you need to do, she said coldly. I'll tell them my version of the story, and we'll see who they believe. I could see in her eyes that she wasn't scared. She wasn't worried about the consequences. It was as though she thought she had the power to get away with anything simply because she had control over the HOA and, by extension, the neighborhood. She had become so accustomed to getting her way that she genuinely believed she could do whatever she wanted without facing any repercussions. I didn't care about her threats. I wasn't backing down. I would do whatever it took to make sure that Karen faced the consequences of her actions. What she had done was not just wrong, it was criminal. I turned to Lily once again, this time helping her into the house, away from Karen's looming presence. I could tell my daughter was still in shock, struggling to process the surreal situation. I made sure to reassure her, reminding her that we would handle it, that she was safe now. As I closed the door behind me, I took one last look at Karen. There was no remorse in her eyes, only cold indifference. In that moment, I knew this wasn't just an isolated incident. This was a woman who had been hiding her true nature for far too long. And I wasn't going to let her get away with hurting my family or anyone else in the neighborhood ever again. The basement incident was the breaking point. It was the catalyst that pushed me to take action. It wasn't just about Karen's power over the HOA anymore. It was about her belief that she could control people's lives with impunity without anyone standing up to her. This was just the beginning, and I was ready to expose everything. After the shocking encounter with Karen, my mind was in a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. I couldn't stop replaying the moment over and over again in my head. My daughter, locked in someone else's basement, scared and confused. This wasn't something I could just sweep under the rug. I had to get to the bottom of it. But as much as I wanted to confront Karen right then and there, I knew I had to be strategic. This was bigger than a single angry neighbor. It was about uncovering the twisted depths of Karen's behavior and stopping her before anyone else got hurt. The first thing I did was calm Lily down. She was still visibly shaken, her face pale, and her hands trembling as she recounted the events. She told me how she had been playing outside with her friends, running around in the yard, when Karen appeared. The next thing she knew, she was inside the basement, locked in without warning. Lily didn't know how long she had been there. Time had blurred into a haze of fear and confusion. She kept telling me that she didn't understand why Karen had done it, why she had been locked in that dark, cold place. I tried my best to reassure her, but inside, my mind was racing. Something didn't add up. Karen's accusation of Lily snooping around didn't fit with Lily's behavior. She wasn't the type of child to sneak into other people's homes, let alone trespass on their property. I knew that deep down, Lily wasn't lying, Karen was. But why? What could she possibly gain from locking a child in her basement and then spinning such an elaborate, fabricated story? I needed answers. I decided to pay Karen a visit the next day. This time, I would approach it differently. I wasn't just going to stand there and let her control the narrative. I had already made up my mind that I wouldn't let her get away with it, and this time, I was going to make her face the truth. I walked up to her house, my heart pounding in my chest. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the neighborhood, but I couldn't shake the unease that settled deep within me. As I knocked on her door, I steeled myself. I wasn't sure how this conversation would go, but I knew I couldn't let her manipulate me into backing down. When Karen answered the door, her expression shifted, just for a moment, from the cold, indifferent mask she had worn the day before to one of faint surprise. She probably hadn't expected me to show up so soon, especially after the way she had dismissed me earlier. But that was exactly the reaction I wanted. "What do you want?" Karen asked, her tone flat and guarded. "I need to understand why you locked my daughter in your basement," I said, my voice firm but calm. Her eyes narrowed, and for a second I thought I saw a flicker of something in her expression, nervousness, maybe even guilt. But then it was gone, replaced by that same icy composure. "I told you already," she replied, her voice rising slightly. "Your daughter was trespassing on my property, and I was doing what any responsible adult would do. She needed to learn a lesson." I could feel the anger bubbling beneath my skin, but I kept my tone even. "That's not an explanation. You don't just lock a child in your basement, Karen. That's not discipline, that's abuse. And it's illegal." Karen scoffed. "You can make all the accusations you want, but you have no proof. It's my word against yours. You can't prove she didn't deserve it." She was smug, almost smug enough to think I would back off. But I wasn't about to let her intimidate me. I knew I had to dig deeper if I wanted to get to the heart of what was really going on. "Let's get something straight," I said, stepping closer, refusing to let her control the situation. "I know Lily didn't do what you're accusing her of, and I know that you're lying. This isn't about what happened yesterday. This is about something much bigger, isn't it? You've been controlling this neighborhood for years, Karen. You've been manipulating people, bullying them into doing what you want. This is just the latest example." The words hit her like a slap. For a brief moment, I saw her face flush and her eyes darted to the side, as if searching for an escape. But then she recovered, her posture stiffening as she crossed her arms. "You don't know what you're talking about," she snapped. "I'm just trying to keep this place in order. People don't appreciate that. They think I'm overbearing, but someone has to keep the peace. Someone has to make sure people follow the rules." Her voice was shaky now, but the defensiveness only confirmed what I already suspected. I was on to something. There was more to Karen's actions than just the incident with Lily. This was part of a larger pattern, one that she had been using to manipulate the entire community for years. I pressed further, leaning in just slightly. "It's not about keeping the peace, Karen. It's about control. You've been using your position in the HOA to intimidate people, to make them scared of you. You think you can get away with anything, don't you? You think you can lock up kids and get away with it because you've been running things for so long? Well, it ends now. You've gone too far." Karen's eyes hardened. "You have no idea what I'm capable of," she said, her voice low and venomous. "I've worked too hard to let someone like you destroy everything I've built here." It was in that moment that I realized just how deep her obsession with control went. This wasn't about a few minor infractions or a misguided sense of order. This was about Karen's need to dominate, to make everyone bend to her will. The HOA wasn't just a volunteer position to her, it was her tool for enforcing her power over everyone else. "You're going to pay for what you've done," I said, my voice steady, though the words felt like they carried the weight of everything I had been holding inside. "You're not just going to intimidate me or my daughter. Not anymore." Karen's face twisted with anger. "You think you can just waltz in here and threaten me?" she spat. "I'll make sure you regret this. No one challenges me and gets away with it." Her words hung in the air like a dark cloud. But I wasn't afraid of her anymore. Karen had underestimated me, thinking I would back down like everyone else had. But I had something she didn't resolve. I wasn't going to let her push me around any longer. "I'm not backing down, Karen. And I'll make sure everyone knows who you really are," I said, my voice resolute. I turned and walked away from her doorstep, feeling the weight of the confrontation settle into my bones. But as I left her house, I knew the battle wasn't over. It had only just begun. Karen had made a dangerous mistake, and now I was going to make sure she faced the consequences. It was time to expose her for who she really was, and I wasn't going to stop until justice was served. The moment I left Karen's house that day, a fire ignited within me. I couldn't let this slide. What had happened to Lily wasn't just a random act of cruelty, it was a calculated abuse of power. Karen had crossed a line, and I was determined to make sure she faced the consequences. I knew it wouldn't be easy, though. She had been entrenched in the community for years, controlling the HOA with an iron grip. She had friends, allies, people who were either too afraid or too complacent to stand up to her. But that didn't matter to me. I wasn't backing down. If Karen thought she could intimidate me into silence, she was gravely mistaken. I had my daughter to protect, and I wasn't going to let this go. The first step in taking action was to gather evidence. Without hard proof, this would be nothing more than a he-said-she-said situation. I needed something tangible to show that Karen wasn't just an overbearing neighbor. She was a criminal who had locked my child in her basement. I couldn't just rely on my word or Lily's. I needed something that would make her actions undeniable. I spent hours digging through any possible source of evidence I could find. I spoke to neighbors, trying to get anyone to come forward with information about Karen's past behavior. At first, people were hesitant. They were afraid of the repercussions of speaking out against her. But slowly, bit by bit, the truth began to emerge. One neighbor, an older woman who lived a few houses down, told me that Karen had once filed complaints against her for the smallest of infractions. The woman had been penalized for a broken mailbox, even though it was a minor issue that had no real impact on the neighborhood. Karen had even insisted that she repaint her fence to match the color of everyone else's, despite the fact that it was perfectly fine. She had a reputation of going after people who didn't toe the line, and I now realized just how far that control had gone. But it wasn't just petty complaints and nitpicking. One neighbor had mentioned seeing Karen acting aggressively toward a family whose teenage son had thrown a ball over her fence. Apparently, Karen had called the police on the family, accusing them of deliberate vandalism and demanding that the child be punished. It was yet another sign of her need to dominate everyone around her, to bend them to her will no matter what. The more I spoke to people, the more I realized how deep Karen's web of control had become. She had made life miserable for anyone who dared to challenge her authority. And now, she had gone too far with my daughter. This wasn't just a series of misunderstandings. This was a pattern of behavior that had escalated over time, and it was time for it to end. Armed with this information, I knew it was time to take the next step, filing a formal complaint with the HOA. Karen had been abusing her position for years, and it was time to bring her actions to light. But I wasn't naive. I knew the HOA board had been her allies for a long time, and they would likely try to sweep this under the rug. Still, I had to try. I couldn't just let her continue her reign of terror. I drafted the complaint, detailing the events with Lily, the witnesses who had come forward, and Karen's long history of intimidating behavior. I made sure to include specific examples of her actions, from her harassment of neighbors to her control over the community's rules and regulations. I even included the evidence from my neighbors about her treatment of other families. This wasn't just about Lily anymore. It was about holding Karen accountable for her actions and stopping her from causing harm to anyone else. The next day, I submitted the complaint to the HOA board. I expected some pushback, but nothing could have prepared me for the response I received. The board called a special meeting to discuss the issue. Karen was there, of course, sitting at the table with a smug look on her face, as if she were untouchable. I could feel the tension in the room the moment I walked in. The other board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. But I wasn't there to play nice. I was there to make sure they understood the gravity of what had happened. I took a deep breath and stood up, my heart pounding in my chest. I recounted everything that had happened, from the moment Karen had locked Lily in her basement to the troubling patterns of her behavior in the neighborhood. I was clear, concise, and most importantly, resolute. There was no room for doubt. Karen had crossed a line, and she needed to be held accountable. At first, the board members seemed hesitant. Some of them avoided eye contact, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. But then a woman named Susan, who had been quiet throughout the meeting, finally spoke up. "I've heard whispers about Karen's behavior for years," she said, her voice shaky but firm. "I've had my own run-ins with her, and I think it's time we address this." That was the moment things started to shift. Susan's words seemed to give the others the courage they needed to speak up. One by one, other board members began to voice their concerns, sharing stories of their own interactions with Karen, all of which painted her in the same light, controlling, manipulative, and willing to go to extreme lengths to maintain her grip on power. It wasn't just my complaint anymore. It was a collective realization that Karen had been abusing her position for far too long. The board members began to discuss what actions they could take to address the situation. And then, finally, they made the decision. Karen would be removed from her position on the board. It was a small victory, but it felt like a massive one. Karen had always thought she was above the rules, that she could do whatever she wanted without consequences. But now she had been exposed, and the neighborhood was finally starting to see her for who she really was. But even though Karen had been removed from her position in the HOA, I knew this wasn't over. There was still the matter of the police, and I wasn't about to let her get away with what she had done to Lily. I contacted the authorities, and after a thorough investigation, they confirmed that what Karen had done was not only wrong but criminal. She was arrested for unlawful imprisonment and endangerment, charges that would ensure she faced serious consequences for her actions. The arrest was the final blow. Karen, who had spent years controlling the lives of others, was now the one facing justice. The neighborhood, once living in fear of her, could finally breathe a sigh of relief. As for Lily and me, the experience had changed us. It had been a hard-fought battle, but in the end, we came out victorious. And I learned something important along the way. When you stand up for what's right, when you refuse to back down in the face of injustice, you can make a difference. This fight wasn't just for Lily, it was for everyone in the neighborhood who had been silently suffering under Karen's control. And I vowed that no matter what happened next, I would continue to fight for what was right. The battle had been long, but it had been worth it. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like the community was finally free from the grip of a woman who thought she could control everything. In the aftermath of Karen's arrest, the neighborhood felt like it was breathing again. The oppressive atmosphere that had hovered over the community for years, thanks to her control, seemed to lift. People were talking, sharing their stories, and for the first time in a long time, they were no longer afraid to speak out. But as much as it felt like a victory, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story, more that Karen had been hiding beneath the surface. I knew I had to get to the bottom of it. Karen may have been arrested, but her reign of terror didn't happen in a vacuum. She wasn't working alone, and there was a bigger story behind her twisted need for control. After her arrest, Karen's life seemed to unravel quickly. The HOA board, which had previously been too afraid to take a stand against her, acted swiftly in removing her from her position. There was no sympathy, no attempt to defend her. The once powerful woman was now a pariah in the community, her influence gone in the blink of an eye. But even though Karen was gone, the questions surrounding her actions lingered. I couldn't help but wonder how much of her behavior was driven by something deeper, something far more sinister. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that Karen's obsession with control went beyond just being a strict HOA member. It was a pattern, a reflection of something deeper within her psyche. But what was it? What drove her to manipulate, intimidate, and hurt so many people for so long? I decided to take matters into my own hands once again. This time, I wasn't going to let the story end with Karen's arrest. I needed to know the full truth. What had really been going on behind closed doors? What was the catalyst for her years of control and cruelty? A few days after Karen's arrest, I met with Susan, the HOA board member who had been the first to speak out during the meeting. She had been a quiet ally throughout the ordeal, and I trusted her. I hoped she could shed some light on things I might have missed, especially when it came to Karen's past. We sat in a local coffee shop away from the tension of a neighborhood, and Susan started to talk. She told me that Karen's behavior hadn't always been so extreme. When she first joined the HOA, Karen was just like any other member, enthusiastic, helpful, and eager to contribute to the community. But something had shifted over time. It was subtle at first, just small signs of control here and there. But as the years passed, Karen's actions grew more and more extreme. The first real signs of her darker side began when she took control of the neighborhood's budget, using her influence to allocate funds for unnecessary projects. There were reports of people who had tried to question her decisions, only to find themselves on the receiving end of a smear campaign. Karen didn't take criticism lightly. Anyone who stood in her way quickly found themselves the target of her wrath. She always made sure she had something on everyone, Susan told me, her voice lowered as if to make sure no one else overheard. If someone tried to challenge her, she would dig into their past. She had a way of finding things that people wanted to keep hidden, and if you didn't fall in line, she'd use it against you. The more Susan spoke, the more I understood just how much power Karen had really accumulated over the years. It wasn't just about the HOA or the neighborhood. It was about controlling every aspect of people's lives. She knew their weaknesses, their insecurities, and she used that information to make sure they stayed under her thumb. It was a web of manipulation, and it extended far beyond anything I had imagined. But that wasn't the most shocking part. As Susan continued, she revealed a bombshell. Karen's control over the neighborhood hadn't been the result of a simple desire for power. It was a reflection of something much darker. Karen had been hiding a deep-seated fear for years. She had suffered a traumatic experience early in her life, something that had twisted her view of the world. Susan didn't know all the details, but she had heard enough to know that Karen's obsession with control was rooted in a deep-seated need for safety that she had never truly felt as a child. Karen had grown up in a dysfunctional household, one filled with emotional abuse and instability. Her father was an alcoholic, and her mother was often absent, emotionally checked out. Karen had learned early on that the only way to survive in that environment was to assert control over everything. She had to be the one who called the shots, who made the rules, because if she didn't, she felt vulnerable. That vulnerability, that fear had shaped the person she became. And as she grew older, she started to realize that the only way to get what she wanted, to keep people from hurting her, was to control them first. Susan's words hit me like a ton of bricks. I had always seen Karen as a villain, as someone who was simply power-hungry and manipulative. But now I understood. Her actions weren't just driven by a thirst for control, they were driven by fear, by the pain of her past. She was trying to protect herself in the only way she knew how. Unfortunately, she had twisted that instinct into something dangerous. It wasn't just the HOA, though, Susan said, looking around the room nervously. Karen had other ways of keeping tabs on people. She had connections, friends in high places, people who worked in local government, law enforcement, and even the media. She had this network of influence that she used to manipulate things behind the scenes. That's how she got away with so much for so long. People were afraid of crossing her because they didn't know who she had in her corner. I was stunned. I had no idea just how far Karen's web of influence extended. It made sense now. Karen wasn't just a tyrant in the neighborhood. She had been playing a long game, using her connections to maintain power and silence anyone who tried to challenge her. But the most terrifying part was the realization that Karen had always been calculating. She had set her sights on power when she was young, and everything she did, every move she made, had been part of that plan. She had used the HOA, her influence, and even her personal relationships to create a system that allowed her to control the lives of everyone around her. And it had worked until now. What now? I asked Susan, my voice quiet but firm. What happens now that people know the truth? Susan looked down, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I don't know. I'm just glad she's gone. But it's going to take time to rebuild. There are people who are still scared of her, still afraid of what she can do. But the community's stronger now. We've all seen what happens when we stand up for what's right. I nodded, understanding what she meant. The truth had come out. And while it wasn't going to be easy, the neighborhood was finally free from Karen's grip. But the journey was far from over. The damage she had done couldn't be undone overnight, and there would be consequences for her actions, both legal and emotional. But one thing was certain. Karen's twisted reign had come to an end. And for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful for the future of the neighborhood. The truth had been exposed, and no matter how dark the past had been, the community was ready to move forward. We were no longer living in fear. And that in itself was a victory. What happened in this neighborhood could happen anywhere. There are always people who think they can control others, manipulate situations, and take advantage of their power. But the truth always comes out, and justice always has a way of finding its path. If you've ever felt powerless against someone like Karen, someone who tries to intimidate or bully you, know that you're not alone. It's time to stand up, speak out, and make sure that people like this no longer have control over your life. If you've dealt with a toxic neighbor or someone who has abused their power, I want to hear from you. Share your stories in the comments below and help others realize that they don't have to suffer in silence. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. This journey of exposing the truth, standing up for what's right, and holding people accountable is just beginning. You don't want to miss what happens next. Together, we can fight for justice, rebuild communities, and make sure that no one ever feels trapped or powerless again. Let's make this the start of something powerful. Your voice matters. Don't let anyone silence it.